Good morning. I'm glad you can devote some time to worship this Sunday. If you are in Northeast Missouri and you are watching this the weekend it comes out, September 10, 11, 2022, please come over on Sunday the 11th, 5 to 7 at Shelbina in our parking lot. We're going to have a fish fry, 5 to 7, our gift to the community. When Jesus says, love your neighbor, we want to be practical about this. And nothing says, I love you like fresh fried fish and taters and snow cones and live music, and it should be a wonderful time. I hope you can come and enjoy this time with us. There are some very random hobbies that people get into, and I am no exception to that. The hobby that I've gotten into that is utterly random is fountain pens. I received a fountain pen this week that, here it is, big old hunk of copper. And as you can tell, if the video camera can see, it has a cross and flame engraved on the top and the bottom. For pen people, that's called finials, but for everyone else, it's the top and the bottom of the pen. And then there's some cross and flames engraved in the body itself. And so this is a pen I purchased. It's from a fellow in the Philippines that hand engraved it, did an amazing job. And I don't usually share these type of things, but I went ahead and put this on Facebook and said, this is a pen I got on the 10th anniversary of my ordination. That's what inspired putting the cross and flame in it. I had kind of pondered, like, if I'm going to have someone do a full pen engraving, what's the pattern I want to use? And that's what made sense to me. It being the 10th anniversary of my ordination, I thought, this is what I'll do. And then people started congratulating me on Facebook of like, congratulations on 10 years of serving the church. And thank you. I appreciate the sentiment, and people were very excited about this. And as I'm really enjoying using it. I wrote this sermon with this pen. However, I realized that most of the people like I'm running into nowadays at the churches I serve don't realize that ordination was 10 years ago, but I started serving churches 20 years ago. And so there was a 10-year process for ordination. And if you say to yourself, 10 years seems like a while, was it supposed to go that long? No, it was not. It was not supposed to take that long by multiple years. So here's the story of why. So I first realized that the ordination process could be bumpy, indeed bumpy weather, when I was being interviewed by a group of pastors, the Board of Ordained Ministry of the Missouri Conference of the Methodist Church. I was being interviewed as I was about to go take my full-time job serving the Buckland and Mount Zion churches. At least that was my hope. But at that point, I have been, this is 2005, 6 or so, and at that point I have gone to seminary out in North Carolina, and I have come back with a Master's of Divinity and just a touch of debt, and I have moved to Missouri hoping to have a church. No promises, like maybe I get one, maybe I don't. And this interview was part of determining that. And so I had prepared my answers to a long set of questions, and I'd submitted something like 50 pages of writing. And so I'm asked, like, help us understand, one of the questions like, help us understand how you interpret the Bible and how you explain that. And I was using the first chapters of Genesis as an example of this. And I was explaining, like, I take the Bible seriously. Sometimes that means you take it literally. Sometimes you don't take it literally, because you shouldn't. To take something seriously is to respect the genre and the intent of the author. And I'm going through this with them, and we've all had the experience where someone's not picking up what you're putting down, and they're looking at you with that like, and you're thinking, oh, if I just talk faster and say more, maybe it'll click, but it doesn't. That's what happened to me. And I thought, ooh, this is dangerous. Like, this is bad. And I said, okay, you can go serve, but you need to work on your ability to explain Scripture, understand theology and explain Scripture. And I thought, well, I can do that, right? I can work on that. I'm about to have 3 years of practice. So I was sent to Buckland, and you state that first interview is like, do we think you might do something? And then 3 years later, after you've had 3 years of practice at it, you were interviewed again to determine whether you will be ordained. And at that point, the question is not, might you do something? The question is, have you done something? Like, you got to show us some fruit. You got to show us some results. Like, we're not going to ordain someone, because once you're ordained, that's a commitment you make to the church, and the church makes to you, that you will always serve, but you are always going to have somewhere to serve. So it's a two-way street there. So to be ordained in the Methodist system, really big deal. So I go for these ordination interviews, and you are interviewed. At that time, the process was you answered a set of questions, and you write 70 pages of paperwork, 70 pages of your own writing, and you were interviewed by theology, sacraments, preaching, and sort of practice. Okay, I get in front of each of these groups, and every group has their own sets of questions, and I come out of this interview, and I do not pass. I will not be ordained that year. You can go back to Buckland, you can keep on serving, but we need you to keep on working on your ability to explain theology and scripture. We're not sure you really understand, which was hard to hear. Like, there are things I'm bad at in life. We don't need to delve into those. Get a cup of coffee, I'll tell you about my mistakes, right? I know there are things I'm not good at, but this doesn't feel like it's one of them. And this particular year, 1/3 of the candidates for ordination were failed. When you give a test and 1/3 of the people taking the test fail, you got to look at the students, but you also got to go look at the test itself. Like, at that point, I think 8 years of being in the ordination process, to have that much of a failure rate, that's a problem, right? So okay, I got to work on theology, and one of the guys from the Board of Ordained Ministry asked me about this, and I said, a lot of people seem angry about this, and which seemed, well, an accurate description. And so my prescriptions, what I needed to do was continue to work on my ability to understand and explain theology, and I needed to go to counseling to work on my anger issues, because all I can figure is that in the process of me saying, there are some people who are angry about this, it came off as, I have anger issues and I'm not willing to say, I'm the one who's angry about it. Like, I was more confused than angry, it seemed. I don't know. It didn't, so I do what I'm told. Right? I go to the counselor who agrees, Andy, you got issues, Andy, but anger ain't one of them. And the counselor and I, we had a great couple sessions chatting about some other things I needed to learn about myself, and it was good. It is good to talk to someone who is wiser about how we function and think through things. I appreciated that time, but we both agreed anger wasn't an issue. And okay, fine, I need to continue to work on my ability to explain theology. And I asked the question, is the worry about my ability to write, or is it about my ability to speak? If it's writing, then I'll rewrite all my paperwork. If it's speaking, then I'll use the same paperwork and I'll try again with it. And I was told, okay, you can use the same paperwork. I come back a year later using the same paperwork. And the people who interviewed me had not gotten the memo that I had received permission the year before to use the same paperwork. And so I was failed a second time. And that was hard. That was hard. And at that point, the best I could figure was that the albatross around my neck was that, like, I'd been pegged as the guy who couldn't explain. And that the paperwork, my request had been lost, and like, this is just not going well. And at that point, like, I have moved to Milan. I've begun my first year at a new church, and so I'm trying to figure out how to get started there. In that first year at Milan, Olivia was living in Macon and working at South Shelby for the first time. And I'm living by myself in Milan, not sure working through trying to figure out how to get started, having been turned down for ordination, and it was hard times, very hard times. There was an offer made, a very serious offer. I could have taken my degree in biology and walked away, doubled my pay, and had a guaranteed job in water chemistry. I could have done it, and it was there, that offer. I went to a guy named Fred Least, a pastor. He was at Kearney at the time, and I knew he was one of the people who could be on I needed to get through this theology interview group, and I knew he was part of that, and I just put myself in front of him. I said, Fred, here's the story. And he said, okay, let's sit down. And we worked through, I rewrote all the paperwork. I'm going to dot every I and cross every T, right? And Fred and I went through all the paperwork and I re-answered it from scratch. And we hashed through every single question so that I had practiced doing it and he had experienced me doing it, so that if there was any problem whatsoever, he could vouch for me because he had heard me do it. And so we spent a goodly chunk of time, and that year I passed and I was ordained, and this pen marks that it was 10 years ago. That's not a particularly enjoyable story to tell. As I look back across what I have done in life, the major events like the end of high school, first chair trombone, and I was an Eagle Scout, and I went to Truman, and I was running jazz festivals, and I did well with my undergrad studies. I excelled in the study of science. And then, I'm going to go to Duke, and I do well at Duke, and I start this street ministry and a hospital chaplain. That was hard, but I think I did well at it. And then I hit this ordination process, and it is just hit this roadblock, and I just failed. And I failed again and again. I failed multiple times, and I failed hard, and I failed publicly, because ordination, everyone goes down there to be ordained. And here I am sitting up in the audiences. My friends who I've been in the ordination process with are being ordained. And after people are ordained, and this happened in Springfield at the time, everyone would go out to, there was a local sort of sports bar just down the road. Everyone would go down and celebrate and toast each other. And I started getting questions like, Andy, what's wrong? And it's I don't know. And so this is not a story I take any joy in. Hard times, right? But in the midst of that story, what I found was that I can say something and mean it profoundly. Let me tell you what I can say. I can say, I follow Jesus, and I'm going to serve in his name. And that's the rock I stand on. On Christ the solid rock I stand, all other else is sinking sand. That song means a lot to me. That is the rock I stand on, right? And I got to the point where I could say, if the church recognizes that, that'd be very good. I would appreciate that. If the church doesn't recognize it, that doesn't change anything about it. It is still true. And I would not have found that rock that I stand on to this day, right? Unless I'd gone through that story, those times, those challenges, that public, repetitive failure. It's not a story I enjoy telling, but it's a story that grounded me in something that I stand on to this day when things are hard. And there are times when serving a church is hard. There are times when serving a church and looking to the future in the midst of some of the travails, it is not easy or simple. But this is what I stand on, right? I found it. In the midst of the storm, that's what I found. This is my rock. I follow Jesus. I serve in his name. Now, before I pivot to Paul, because this does turn back to Paul, I do need to tell you something really important. I was ordained in the midst of the Missouri Conference merging. The Missouri East and Missouri West had come together to form the Missouri Conference. And in the process, that a lot more people were coming through this Board of Ordained Ministry than ever before, A, and B, they had implemented a new process that they thought would help them handle this. And it didn't. And that process changed. Thank God. And it changed based upon feedback from people, including myself, so that people are tracked more effectively, so that things like requests to use the same paperwork don't get forgotten, all right? And so that it's more gracious, more continuous. And so the method of ordination in Missouri is far better than it was when I went through. For that, I am thankful. I'm very thankful, right? Paul writes to the church at Corinth. We listen to how he writes to them, and when he writes to them, it's in the second chapter of the first letter at Corinth. He tells them that he came to them without any fancy words or wise language. All he had was his story. And the story that he told was the story of his failure, right? Paul's story. Rewind Paul's story. When he shows up at Corinth, right, he is telling the story of Jesus and he gathers and starts the church, and that's great. But if you rewind that story back, you rewind it back to Paul was the person who organized the persecution of Christians. Paul was the one who had the paperwork, and he was going out to another town to bring the paperwork to authorize and organize the persecution of Christians. And on that journey, Jesus took a 2x4 to the back of his head and said, Paul, why do you persecute me? And Paul had this very literal, come to Jesus moment. Fell off his horse, can't see, and he has to acknowledge that he was wrong. He had failed. He had been trained in the reading of Scripture. He is a rabbi. He's trained in the reading of Scripture, and he had not been able to see how the Scriptures of the Hebrew Testament, the Jewish prophets, had pointed to Jesus, and he just whiffed. And so the story he tells is, I got it wrong. Jesus called me and forgave me and gave me a purpose and a task that's worth spending my entire life doing. And I want to invite you to consider doing this with me, to follow Jesus. I was wrong and I got right? And I'm inviting you to get right too. It is a nerve-wracking story to tell. Paul tells us, he told this story. He tells the church at Corinth, I told you this story with trepidation and fear and trembling, and he had every right to, because not only is this a story of his failure, he's telling it to the church at Corinth. Corinth is a place that controls a trade route, and it was a cantankerous city that could not get along with others, and so 2 centuries before Paul, it had been destroyed. And then Rome, the Roman Empire, rebuilt it because they wanted the income from the trade route. And so they did. They rebuilt the city. But who do you get to populate a new city? The people you get to populate the new city are the people who are the most mobile, who have no connections. Yes, soldiers, retired soldiers go and they populate Corinth. And if you think that a bunch of retired soldiers who have no connection to the land, there's no civic culture built up, there's no institutions, right? It's just a bunch of retired soldiers. If you think, man, that may not be the best, most low-key place to be, you'd be right. In the first century, to call someone Corinthian was an insult, right? It was calling them brutish and lowbrow, right? That Corinthians, right? They don't want to. So Paul is talking about how he tells his story of failure to a bunch of Corinthians, and he is worried, and he has every right to be. But the people listen. They gather around him, and they say, this story is powerful, and we find it to be true, and we're going to walk with you because we think we want what you have. And that's what Paul points at, right? He points at that this simple story, this powerful story of failure and forgiveness and finding a purpose, that is what brought people to church. And he points out he could have blitzed this up with rhetoric, right? The special effects of the day. If we want to glitz something up, we can use CGI and graphics and video and all that. There was a version of it back then. It was called the use of a rhetoric, and then you can use fancy rhetoric to get people's attention. And he says, I didn't use the fancy words of the rhetoric. What I trusted was I would tell you this story that was true, and you would experience it as true because the Spirit would move and you would say, let me try this, let me walk with you, let me try to follow Jesus, and the Spirit would move, and what the Spirit does is convicts that this is something real and powerful. And that's what happened. And the church at Corinth is built because Paul is willing to be vulnerable and tell his story. The Spirit convicts that this story is true, and then people are willing to follow based upon that, right? What Paul reminds the church at Corinth as he's moving into the next chunk of the letter, he hasn't even gotten to start talking about the topics they raise. He is still laying the groundwork to remember, folks, right? The story we have, the story I came to you, is not a story of glitz and glamour. It's not a story where I have everything figured out. It is a story of me failing and Jesus forgiving and inviting you to do the same. And when we are willing to be vulnerable with each other like that, people's lives change. People's lives change. And if you go back to the life of Paul, right? If you go back to the life of Paul, he has this massive failure where he is holding the coats of the people stoning Stephen, the first Christian martyr, back at the beginning of the book of Acts. And then he has this falling off the horse moment with Jesus where Jesus asks, why are you persecuting me? He goes into the wilderness for multiple years. Like, he has to heal and put himself back together and refigure his life. And so when I say these stories are powerful, that doesn't mean you go out and you tell the story right away, because frankly, it's just too hard. I haven't told this story about my ordination publicly, ever. Because friends, it was too hard. It was just too hard. But now I can. And because I can, maybe you can take that risk too. Maybe you can see, right? In the midst of our greatest failures, our greatest travails, our greatest trials, that's when we find the rock that we stand on. And when we tell people, we invite them to church, we invite them to consider faith, we invite them to come to the fish fry, we invite them to be involved in us as people who follow Jesus. We're not going to them and saying, I have all the answers, I am successful, I have all the answers, and you just need to join me and you'll be successful and have all the answers too. That is not what we have to offer. What we have to offer is what Paul had to offer. I failed, and I found grace and forgiveness and healing. And I don't have the answers, but what I do have is I follow Jesus, and that is the confirmation of the Spirit moving my life, right? That is confirmed as my experience was what is true and beautiful and good. My friends, I hope you can tell your stories too, because your stories are powerful. They matter. And when you can tell your stories of how God has worked in your life in this way, you can help other people realize it and have their lives be changed as well. Amen.